In casual conversation, we use vague language all the time. Saying "there in a minute" or "pretty tired" works perfectly fine when nothing important is on the line. But take that same imprecise language and use it to support a strict conclusion in a formal argument, and the logic breaks down. The misuse of a vague expression fallacy violates the acceptability criterion. If a foundation premise is blurry, your conclusion has nothing solid to stand on. This collapse happens when arguers build on that blur, or listeners stamp a rigid definition onto a general statement. In both cases, the vagueness acts as a smokescreen. Without clear terms, you cannot weigh evidence, and you cannot have a fair debate. Let's look at how a listener can weaponize this fallacy. Imagine a college president at a faculty meeting asking the staff to show more concern for some of our weaker students. A professor immediately responds with outrage, declaring he will quit before he is forced to give a passing grade to a student who did not deserve it. The president never said anything about changing grades. The professor committed the logical error here by assigning a hyper-specific, entirely unjustified meaning to the president's broad request. When a listener projects their own rigid demands onto someone else's general statement, they fabricate an argument that was never actually made, completely derailing the real conversation. Arguers use this same tactic to force a conclusion. In one legal case, a prosecutor tried to convict a bookstore owner of distributing pornography based on a violation of local community standards. But community standards is an incredibly vague legal term. To make his case work, the prosecutor arbitrarily defined the standard as anything that offends more than half the people in town. The argument fails the acceptability criterion. The prosecutor offered zero evidence to support this rigid translation of a fluid concept. By setting an arbitrary threshold, a fair defense becomes impossible. An attorney cannot weigh counterevidence against a standard invented on the spot. You cannot take a vague rule and magically transform it into a strict mathematical formula without proof. Doing so deprives the opposing side of any fair framework for debate. This diagram maps out a public school controversy. Critics argued a new literature textbook violated a state mandate for moral education because some characters in the stories performed immoral acts. Therefore, they concluded the book should be banned. Take a moment, look at the logic here. Pause the video and determine who is committing the fallacy and exactly how the vague term is being arbitrarily defined. The answer is the critics. They commit the fallacy by assigning an absurdly tight precision to the vague term moral education, interpreting it to mean students can only ever read about perfectly moral behavior. If we follow their exact, arbitrary definition, almost all historical literature would be outlawed. Even the Bible, which is filled with stories of people committing immoral acts, would fail their test. Arbitrary precision generates logical flaws that manifest as absurd real-world consequences, ultimately destroying the original intent of a rule. When you encounter this fallacy in a debate, your primary defense is to halt the argument, directly challenge the premise's acceptability, and insist that the speaker clarify their vague terms before you proceed. If you are the one speaking, and a listener tries to force a strict interpretation onto your words, reject their unearned precision immediately. Push the conversation back to your original, broader context. This checklist shows how to neutralize the trap in 3 steps. First, spot the vague term in the premise. Second, identify where the arbitrary leap to a strict definition occurs. Third, demand a clear definition. Far from being difficult or picky, demanding a clear definition is the fundamental requirement for a fair and functional pursuit of truth.